They're mostly all here. My one brother does live in Drayton Valley, but the others are all in Edmonton.
That's not too far.
I think we'll get started. It's time 7, so we'll get started. Okay, turn on the mic. Oh, sure. Hello, good evening and welcome. I am Dr. Sam Thompson. I'll do it again. Okay, good evening, welcome. I'm Dr. Sam Thompson. I teach here at Concordia Lutheran Seminary and the Dean of Student Life and Chaplain. I'm so glad to see you all here, and also those who are joining us online. Welcome. We know that Concordia Lutheran Seminary is committed to train pastors and deacons for Jesus' sake. And our ministry is not just limited to training pastors and teachers, but also we are committed to the ministry of the church. So one of the ways in which we do that is through this Quest course. And this Quest course, we all know, is kind of, we feature professors and also some of the best Lutheran teachers we have today, and they present various topics of interest to us. Some of the past Quest series dealt with Lutheran spirituality, Old Testament studies in Old Testament and New Testament, spiritual warfare, missions, Lutheran paradoxes, and we had another session on world religion. So we have different topics. We cover different topics from time to time. And Quest series usually happens in fall and winter 2 times a year, and runs 4 weeks. 8 sessions, and it's a great time where we bring God's Word, theology, best theology to everyone. So this is usually in person, and also we live stream it, and also we record those so that it will be available for us to watch later if you would like to watch, or if you have missed this session, you can always go back to the YouTube channel and find these courses available there. And today I'm so excited and happy to present Dr. Heck for you. And Dr. Heck need no introduction. He's our interim president, and he's an Old Testament scholar, and he's an author, he's a speaker, and also he's a C.S. Lewis expert, world-renowned, I would say, world-renowned C.S. Lewis expert. This is his, I guess, 3rd Quest series, and the first one he did it on Chronicles of Narnia, I guess, and then the second one in 2024, last year, he did it on Life of C.S. Lewis, and I understand this time we will have something more exciting. Others were also exciting, I'm sure. This is like this is on the major concepts or major, kind of major emphasis in C.S. Lewis, and also drawing out resources from C.S. Lewis for missions for 21st century. So with that words, I welcome Dr. Heck to present his lecture and take it on from here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thompson. And this is entirely free of charge. So one of the reasons why it's free of charge is because We have all kinds of generous supporters around the church, many in Edmonton and many far beyond. If you're one of those or many of those, thank you very much for your support of the seminary. If you're not one of those, I'm not going to come tracking you down and twisting your arm. We do appreciate the support of our church, and if you put us in your list of ministries that you support, we thank you very much for that. But this is not going to cost you anything unless you are motivated by something that is presented that motivates you to live in a particular way or to change some of your priorities in life. But as we get started, I want to tell you about the three kinds of people that I am suspicious about. Just want you to know this. Just full disclosure, the first kind of person I'm suspicious about is the person who sits way in the back of the room. I've had a lot of students that do that, and you know what the stereotype is of that group. They are the troublemakers. They're the ones that like to whisper and talk to one another and pass notes, and they think they're not going to be noticed if they sit in the back of the room. The second group that I'm really suspicious about is the group that sits way in the front.
Oh dear.
Because those are, like in my classroom, those were always the people that were trying to get close to the professor and maybe influence them a little bit. And if their semester grade is between an A and a B, maybe if I'm nice to him, he'll give me the A instead. And so we used to call them brown noses. I don't know that term is used anymore. Teacher's pet's another word for that. So that's the second group that I'm suspicious about. And the third group is the group that sits in the middle. They're the group that doesn't know who they are. They don't want to identify with this group or that group, and they're kind of wishy-washy, don't know where they stand, so they seat themselves in the middle. So other than those three groups, I'm not suspicious about anybody that's here this evening. But I do want to dive into the topic for this evening, the single most important concept in the writings of C.S. Lewis. And I've deliberately held back the handout. I've got a handout for you that I'll give you in I'll hand it out. That's what handouts are for, right? I'll give you that in just a couple of minutes after I invite you to think about how would you answer the question, what is the single most important concept in the writings of C.S. Lewis? And if you are totally unfamiliar with Lewis, of course, wouldn't expect you to respond to that question. But if you know a little bit about Lewis, read some of his writings, maybe especially recently, if it's a little bit more distant, maybe you won't know. But so what would you, anybody want to venture a guess what they think is the key concept?
Maybe substitutionary atonement?
Substitutionary atonement, good guess. Anybody else?
Less theological, but I loved his imagination. And for Christians to imagine, to me, is part of faith.
Imagination, yeah, okay. I mean, these are concepts that are in Lewis. And of course, what I'm doing here with this presentation is making a case for another concept that you might disagree with, but I think it's pretty much on target. Anybody else? Had I been in your shoes 30 years ago and been asked the question, I would not answer the way I'm going to answer it. Derek, do you want to?
I was going to say kind of this blending of romanticism and rationalism, kind of being the romantic with his imagination, but yet also very keen with his reason and rationality.
Yes, the two sides of the brain coming together, very powerfully done in Lewis. That's one of his strengths. That's two, though. You only get one. So the answer is, are you ready to be surprised?
Yes.
Desire. This might totally knock your socks off, but let's get into some definition of this, because the idea of desire, first of all, define it. Basically, it's what you think it means, but Lewis gives it a special emphasis, special twist. So longing or yearning, basically synonyms of desire. Lewis's special term for this concept is the word joy, as in his autobiography called Surprised by Joy. And the surprising thing about it for me is that it has very little to do with our concept of joy, happiness, sort of a deep, abiding, internal happiness. That phrase is borrowed from, I think it's Wordsworth, one of the lines of Wordsworth poetry, but I don't recall if it's exactly that. But he uses that title in this autobiography at a time, this is sort of the irony or the jokes on Lewis, when he was getting well acquainted with the woman he would one day marry, and her first name was Joy. And so the joke around Oxford at the time was, hey, have you heard C.S. Lewis is surprised by joy? His book having recently come out. The German word Sehnsucht is a German equivalent of the word longing or desire. Like in his book, The Abolition of Man, Lewis used the Chinese word Dao to express an objective standard of right and wrong. And he liked this German word because it wouldn't carry all kinds of unusual connotations. For us, desire is usually something to be suppressed because it takes us in a wrong direction. But it's really a good concept if you define it rightly, as Lewis, I think, does. So Sehnsucht is such an important concept that there is a periodical, a journal, established in 2007, whose title is Sehnsucht. And notice that it's subtitled the C.S. Lewis Journal. So they only publish articles about Lewis. They get into some depth. Some of it's scholarly, some of it's lighter. They publish poetry and book reviews, but mostly articles about Lewis under this theme of Sehnsucht, or joy or desire. Few near synonyms: mysticism, alienation, separation. There's some overlap between that and Lewis's concept. The numinous, that sort of quasi-spiritual feeling that you have at times under certain circumstances. Some refer to nostalgia, exhilaration, melancholy. In German literature, some German literature, it's the search for the blue flower. Corbin Scott Carnell wrote a book about Lewis's fundamental concept. He says it has long been subsumed in something else, namely, and Derek is going to say, see, I was half right, Romanticism. So I'm going to spin through that a little bit. Corbin Scott Carnell wrote this book, Bright Shadow of Reality, that really zeroes in on Lewis and what Lewis had to say about desire. And he thinks that Romanticism, because it emphasizes the emotion rather than the reason, the heart opposed to the head, desire to find the infinite within the finite, to love the world of fairy or fairy tales, to dream of better times, longing for something else than what we're experiencing right now, liberation of the less conscious levels of the mind, intoxicated dreaming. This is Carnell talking about Romanticism. A revival of the sense of wonder at the everyday and the commonplace. So one of the sad things about living in a world that is very scientifically oriented is that we tend to lose the wonder of the ordinary experiences as we take a walk out in the world of nature and pause to look at a flower and see how beautifully and intricately it's formed. Vague aspiration, as these are some of the things Carnell says are definitions or explanations of this idea of Romanticism. Is desire, I like this image, don't you? Is desire good or bad? And like I said earlier, desire is usually thought of, we think of it in a world that's full of sin, as something that we need to suppress, need to keep under control, and certainly desire can be that. But Lewis himself, in his book, The Great Divorce, says no natural feelings are high or low, holy or unholy in themselves. So desire isn't necessarily wrong. And again, it's not necessarily right either. It depends. They're all holy when God's hand is on the rein. They all go bad when they set up on their own and make themselves into false gods. Even love is that way, because extreme devotion to something that ought not to be the object of our devotion can steer us in the wrong direction. Maybe the most iconic example in all of last 100 years or so of literature and filmmaking would be this guy. Some of you, maybe most of you, maybe all of you recognize the feature the figure of Gollum in J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, who desired that ring because of what it was capable of doing for him, turning him invisible, enabling him to acquire power that he didn't have on his own. And he's always talking, after he loses the ring, he's always talking about his precious. He wants to have that ring back, but he has lost it, and Bilbo found it and passed it on to Frodo. Well, so I got to make my case, I think, a little bit if I'm going to defend the idea that desire is the most important concept, the most omnipresent concept in the writings of Lewis. So what are some examples of desire in Lewis's life? And expect to be a little bit surprised by the things that Lewis looks at, because he always seems to look at ordinary things in different ways than we typically do. So some of his early experiences with desire he describes, and SBJ is my abbreviation for surprised by joy. He is enraptured by a biscuit tin, the lid of a cookie jar in English language. His brother wore and decorated. It was a sensation, of course, of desire, but desire for what? Not certainly for a biscuit tin filled with moss, or even, though it came into that, from my own past. Before I knew what I desired, the desire itself was gone. The whole glimpse withdrawn, the world turned commonplace again, or only stirred by a longing for the longing that had just ceased. It had taken only a moment of time, and in a certain sense, everything else that had ever happened to me was insignificant in comparison. That phrase there at the bottom of that screen is part of making the case for this being the most important concept in Lewis, because if everything else that happened to him is insignificant next to this early experience with desire, then this is a really huge idea in Lewis's thinking. In the same book, he talks about the idea of autumn. He says it sounds fantastic to say that one can be enamored of a season, but that is something like what happened. And as before, the experience was one of intense desire, and one went back to the book not to gratify the desire. That was impossible. How could one possess autumn? But to reawaken. And in this experience also there was the same surprise and the same sense of incalculable importance. It was something quite different from ordinary life, and even from ordinary pleasure, something, as they would now say, in another dimension. Third experience in Lewis's early life was with a god in Norse mythology called Balder. I knew nothing about Balder, but I desired with almost sickening density something never to be described. And then, as another example, found myself at the very moment already falling out of that desire and wishing I were back in it. Now, this next slide will make my case because Lewis makes his case, and I've underlined the appropriate parts of this quotation. The reader who finds these 3 episodes of no interest need read this book no further, so the people online can shut off their computer screens, or those in the room can walk out the door if you want. For in a sense, the central story of my life is about nothing else. For those who are still disposed to proceed, I will only underline the quality common to the 3 experiences. It is that of an unsatisfied desire, which itself is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. I call it joy, which is here a technical term, and must be sharply distinguished both from happiness and from pleasure. So Lewis wrote about desire in a lot of different ways, especially in 5 significant images that for him evoked longing, some from childhood, some from later on in his adult life. The distant hills, the exotic garden, the utter east. Any Reepicheep fans out there from the Chronicles of Narnia? Music of a particular kind. That this may be a place where it starts to connect with you more than it has previously, because all of us, maybe all of us, hopefully most or all of us have really enjoyed a certain type of music. We gravitate to certain kinds, but maybe not to others. And when we're listening to that style of music, it sort of lifts us significantly. Or the world of fairy, the fairy tale, a lot of which Lewis himself wrote. So a little bit more closely at each of these five. The distant hills. The Castlereagh Hills, Lewis says, which we saw from the nursery windows as a little kid, taught me longing, Sehnsucht, made me for good or ill, and before I was 6 years old, a votary of the blue flower. That's that symbol of the Romanticism movement. From the green Castlereagh Hills, from his nursery window, is supplied by Joy. Far Off Hills in Dimer, a lengthy, rather unusual poem that he wrote in the 1920s. And in the book Till We Have Faces, if any of you have read that, most of us probably haven't, Psyche's Gold and Amber House. So the distant hills sometimes create within us even, maybe just a little bit, a longing to be what we're seeing in the distance, longing to travel to that place. The exotic garden. Well, I already mentioned his brother's toy garden, which wasn't all that exotic, but he was just a little boy at that point, and he had never experienced anything quite like that. The fabled garden of the Hesperides, I am not even sure I know what that is, but it's a sort of a mythological garden he writes about in his collection. His first book ever published, Spirits in Bondage, which is a collection of poems from his atheistic years, where he's complaining about a God that he doesn't believe in and finding it, why should you complain about someone you don't believe in? A valley surrounded by tall mountains with a sapphire-colored lake and an island of pale red. This is described in the first of his adult fictions in the Ransom trilogy, a book out of the Silent Planet. And if you've read, again, another echo of Narnia, The Magician's Nephew, where there's that high hill that Fledge takes one of the children to in order to rescue. This is Diggory, to get an apple from that garden to bring back. Eventually, an apple cures Diggory's mother, who is dying of some serious disease. The exotic garden enraptured Lewis, created that desire within him. The utter east. He wrote a poem that hardly anyone has ever heard of called The Landing. Tells of a search for the mythical garden. In Out of the Silent Planet, there's an island that the angelic leader of Mars, known as Malacandra, that book, angelic leader is called the Oyarsa. There's an island there that's in the utter east. Pilgrim's Regress, Lewis's autobiographical allegory about his search for God. He sees an island in the distance, kind of like the distant hills, only this is an island and it's out there in the east, and he wants to get there, and eventually he does. Reepicheep, his desire for the utter east. So let's go to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, shall we? And this is one of the drawings from The Magician's Nephew by Pauline Baynes, the artist of the Chronicles of Narnia. For the 50th edition of Narnia, all the drawings were colorized, and the 7 books were reissued with the stronger cardstock. And so this is Reepicheep from that book. He says, when I was in my cradle, a wood woman, a dryad, spoke this verse over me: where sky and water meet, where the waves grow sweet, doubt not, Reepicheep, to find all you seek. There is the utter east. I do not know what it means, but the spell of it has been on me all my life. I mean, it's as though Lewis was embodied in Reepicheep, because he says, compared to that early experience, nothing else has ever happened that's been significant in my life, sort of putting his own ideas into Reepicheep's mouth. And if you have read that book, you have a better understanding of that. And if you haven't read the book, you might just be motivated to pick it up and read it. Number 4, music of a particular kind. This is Jack on the left and Warnie on the right, C.S. Lewis on the left and Warren on the right. And if your name was Clive Staples Lewis, wouldn't you go by C.S.? In the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, a sweet breeze comes out of the east, and with it a musical sound. Oops, I went too fast. an essay called Transposition. Lewis discusses a passage in Samuel Pepys' diary from, I think, 17th century England, which describes this kind of music. Early in life, let's see, in 1911, he's about 13 years old. He loved the music of Richard Wagner, The Ring of the Nibelung especially, and those operas about a magic ring. Might have influenced Tolkien a little bit there. While at Cherbourg House in 1912, as a 13, 14-year-old kid, he wrote an essay on the development of the opera as a genre and Wagner's influence on it. For the next 20 years or so, Wagner's music would provide another reason for holding to his pessimistic view of the universe, because Wagner's opera cycle was very dark and pessimistic. I guess that's Wagner. His longing for the music of Wagner pointed to another desire for something out of this world. So for Lewis, at this time in life, it provided a reason to reject the claims of Christianity. He claimed that he became an atheist when he was 13 years old. A little bit young to adopt atheism, but he was very smart, very intelligent, very precocious young man. Most of the music closely associated with Christian worship could not compare to the compositions of Bach, Handel, Mozart, and Wagner. Bach was a Lutheran Christian, so he might not have made that connection. He once wrote, "The sentimentality and cheapness of much Christian hymnody had been a strong point in my own resistance to conversion." He's saying that some of the words and some of the tunes and some of our hymns are not exactly enrapturing, shall we say? Last of those 5 images, the world of fairy. Fairy tales stir a person with the dim sense of something beyond his reach and far from dulling or emptying the actual world, gives it a new dimension of depth, Lewis writes in one of his essays, later on gathered together and published in a book called Of Other Worlds. Lewis says that a child asks for the same fairy story again and again, even when he knows the outcome, because he wants the glimpse of fairy, this other world, what Tolkien called the piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire, in Tolkien's powerful essay on fairy stories. Corbin Scott Carnell says that people simply cannot live without the dimension of wonder. If we simply live our everyday world in the mundane sequence of events with no joy, no beauty, no wonder, it drives us up a wall. And because of that, I believe that the world of fairy could draw many outside the faith to Christian belief in the years ahead. And one of the reasons why I advocate giving away The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a Christian tract. A little bit on the expensive side if you're looking at buying 100 tracts for $4 or $5, and instead buying a few copies of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for 10, 20 bucks a piece, but nevertheless more likely to have an impact on people's lives as they start thinking about the world of England in which those 4 children live, and then this parallel world of Narnia, which is roughly what the spiritual world is to followers of Jesus. Well, how did Lewis get there? And he got there quite early in life, but he was reading very early in life. He read Paradise Lost when he was 8 years old. Now, if you've read Paradise Lost, you're impressed. If you've not read it, not sure if you should be impressed or not, but we just got a whistle, so I think at least one person is impressed, and if Derek is, you should be too. So William Wordsworth. Lewis says Wordsworth's expedient was to identify this desire, this longing for certain moments in the past, but all this is a cheat. If Wordsworth had gone back to those moments in the past, he would not have found the thing itself, but only the reminder of it, what he remembered, would turn out to be itself a remembering. So what is the longing for? We're going to get to that eventually in this presentation. So longing is not a desire for the past, even though that desire for the past sometimes gets us thinking very deeply about what's important in our lives, can have value, to be sure. William Morris, author I never heard of till I started reading Lewis, he says the world of Morris became a frequent medium of joy. He loved reading Morris's stories. He read Morris's 10,000-line epic poem, the story of Sigurd the Volsung, and the Fall of the Nibelungs, stories of heroic battles and warriors and bravery and treachery, love and desire. He read Morris's book, The Well at the World's End, which itself is a very provocative title. He says, I've been reading again The Well at the World's End, and it has completely ravished me. There's something awfully nice about reading a book again with all the half-unconscious memories it brings back. The Well always brings to mind our lovely hill walk. He's writing to a friend of his in the frost and fog, you remember, because I was reading it then. The very names of chapters and places make me happy. And then he gives several names of chapters. Another Adventure in the Wood Perilous. Ralph rides the downs to Higham on the way. The Dry Tree. Ralph reads in a book concerning the Well at the World's End. I like that book enough to read it 3 times. I mean, other than the Bible, I'm not sure how many books I've read more than once. Certainly Sheldon Van Auken's book, A Severe Mercy, which is in my top 10, by the way, but really a great, great read if you like Lewis, if you like stories of conversion and are not put off by the potential for reading something about tragedy. Very, very powerful book, extremely well written by a professor of English. Those English teachers really know how to write books. And by the way, both Tolkien and Lewis were English teachers. So Jack's brother Warren read the book on Jack's recommendation, and in an essay in the 1930s he wrote about Morris, and Morris writes, so that we really taste the mountain air. So in that essay, Lewis says Morris, like a true pagan, does not tell us the ultimate significance of those moments in which we cannot help reaching out for something beyond the visible world, and so discovering at what unmeasured price man sets his life. So again, what is that longing searching for? Morris is asking, but he never quite knows. Morris has this haunting desire for immortality. That seems to be part of what Morris is looking for, and gives us a hint of where that longing can be satisfied. Well, in 1914, Lewis met a lifelong friend by the name of Arthur Greaves, and this is from the autobiography again, Surprised by Joy. And he was encouraged to go across the street to visit Arthur, who was not well. He was sick, and so he finally goes to see the guy, even though he's been told he should do this many times and has never done it. He says, I found Arthur sitting up in bed on the table. Beside him lay a copy of Myths of the Norsemen, more of that fairy story kind of stuff. Do you like that? Said I. Do you like that? Said he. Next moment, the book was in our hands. Our heads were bent close together. We were pointing, quoting, talking, soon almost shouting, discovering in a torrent of questions that we liked not only the same thing, but the same parts of it, and in the same way, that we both knew the stab of joy, and that for both the arrow was shot from the north. So a kindred spirit who's thinking like Lewis is thinking about this concept of desire or longing or joy. Well, Lewis moved on from William Morris to a new favorite author, and George MacDonald was that favorite author, who became a writer that Lewis called his master, and he once said that he didn't think that he ever wrote a book in which he did not quote George MacDonald. So he buys this book, Phantastes is Greek for fantasies, 1916, still an atheist, but this book started him on the road from atheism to Christianity. I knew that I had crossed a great frontier once he started reading the book. Phantastes was romantic enough in all conscience, quality of the real universe and divine, magical, terrifying, and ecstatic reality in which we all live, even though there are those days, those moments when things are pretty ordinary. But MacDonald got him outside of his rather arid atheism at this point and began to teach him, remind him, help him to know that the imagination had some significant power that he was denying with his atheistic worldview. So Lewis also read Baron Friedrich von Hugel. Lewis, by the way, I'm going to mention the all kinds of people that Lewis read. He probably read, I did a study of his diary between 1922 and 1927, and I found out that all the books that he mentions in that diary, and compared to the number of days that he records what he's doing, he read one book about every 2.6 days. So he was an avid reader. Somebody, one of his contemporaries, called him the best read man in all of England at the time, and I don't doubt that. But he wrote, so he read von Hugel's Eternal Life, thinking about that, being attracted by the title, and then he wrote on the cover of the book, "It is not an abstraction called humanity that is to be saved, it is you, your soul, and in some sense yet to be understood, even your body. It was made for the high and holy place. All that you are, every fold and crease of your individuality was devised from all eternity to fit God as a glove fits a hand." Sounds a little bit like Augustine or Pascal there. "All that intimate particularity which you can hardly grasp yourself, much less communicate to your fellow creatures, is no mystery to him. He made those ins and outs that you might fill them. And he gave your soul so curious a life because it is the key designed to unlock that door of all the myriad doors in him." So he's directing our attention with these words to God, and therein lies the object of our ultimate desire, even if we are in our daily experiencing desiring something else. Ultimately, it's a desire for God. So how does it show up in the writings of Lewis? It shows up especially in 4 works. Mere Christianity, I bet a few of you have read that. His essay, The Weight of Glory, which was one of the topics I addressed in the spring quest course. The Pilgrim's Regress, which is his allegorical story of his conversion, and then Surprised by Joy. I've quoted from that book several times already in this presentation, so that one is kind of expected. One of his poems in his first published book says, "Adam's dead could never thus stir the human heart of us, unless the beauty that we see the veil of endless beauty be, filled full of spirits that have trod far hence along the heavenly sod and seen the bright footprints of God." This is an atheist saying this, and yet he is honest. He's a good atheist, if you will. He's an honest enough writer to realize that there's something about God in this universe, even though I turn my back on it or deny it. In Dahmer, I mentioned that earlier, Carver Scott Carnell says the influence of George MacDonald is evident. In Saint Suit, longing is clearly the theme of the book. Dahmer lives what Lewis called a dialectic of desire, sort of a give and take, looking for desire, finding desire or joy elusive, trying to grab it, unable to grab it. If you were with me in the spring for the quest course, when we looked at The Weight of Glory, Lewis calls it the inconsolable secret, which hurts so much that you take your revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia and romanticism and adolescence. The secret also which pierces with such sweetness that when in very intimate conversation the mention of it grows imminent, we grow awkward and affect to laugh at ourselves. The secret which we cannot hide and cannot tell, though we desire to do both. Probably in about 1943, Jack wrote an essay called My First School, containing his understanding of joy, based on his negative experiences at a school in about 1910. He says, "To live by hope and longing is an art that was taught at my school. It does not surprise me that there should be 2 worlds." When he was in school, he's longing to be home for the holidays, and when he was back home, he was dreading to be back at school. So the schools, the negative experiences taught him to long for something better, and who of us hasn't been in a position where we long for a world that was better, our own life that was better, a job that was better, a friendship that was better, whatever that was better. I said Mere Christianity is one of the major places he talks about it, and his chapters, 2 chapters on hope, are not all that much appreciated, but I think this chapter may be the best chapter in the whole book. Christian says creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing, or to send us looking for the real thing, which is God Himself. And again, a clue to our reaching a fairly secular world in Canada. If that is so, he says, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and to help others do the same. That's Lewis's life mission, is to point people to the God that created them and redeemed them. Mere Christianity, he says, writes about a far-off country that is near the stage where the road passes over the rim of our world. No one's eyes can see very far beyond that. And if you hear Lewis say this when he's giving this BBC address in the early 1940s, and you're understanding what he's saying, I don't think you can help but be drawn to the rim of the world and the desire to see beyond that edge of the world. And the problem of pain, Lewis calls it a secret thread, something always on the verge of breaking through, the smell of cut wood in the workshop, or the clap of water against the boat's side. And so these are examples from different parts of Lewis. In English literature in the 16th century, writes about Ireland, what Ireland can do to him, such colors in the sky, such lure in the distance, such sadness in the evenings, oh, the dreaming, the torturing, heart scalding, never satisfying dreaming. In Dimer, he says, joy flickers on the razor edge of the present and is gone. In Pilgrim's Regress, John, who is himself really Lewis, hears sweet, strange music and a voice that says, come. And he subsequently desires to find the island, again from Pilgrim's Regress and then Perelandra. The idea of a quest, as in the Pilgrim's Regress, reappears in the Ransom trilogy. A trip for gold to Mars, a trip from Earth to Venus in a coffin, and the battle against evil forces that includes the search for the ancient magician Merlin. I mean, this guy's imagination was out of this world, so to speak. Pilgrim's Regress says, not every object which fancy and the sense suggested for the desire proved a failure, confessed itself after trial not to be what you wanted. Have you not found by elimination that this desire is the perilous siege in which only one can sit? I mean, I remember the first car I bought many years ago, how it was a used car, but it was new to me. I was thrilled to own this car the first day I owned it, and maybe the second or third, but a week later, somehow it had lost its luster. It wasn't what I was really desiring, except I didn't know what I was desiring. Again, this endless desire, which so easily confuses itself with other desires and at best remains pure only by knowing what it does not want. You see that it is the starting point from which one road leads home and 1,000 roads lead into the wilderness. As often as men become pagans again, the landlord, which is his word for God in Regress, sends them pictures and stirs up sweet desire and so leads them back to Mother Kirk even as he led the actual pagans long ago. Indeed, there is no other way. So he wrote in this book about fits of strange desire for something not this, farther, far farther, or yonder. I think I'll skip over this a little bit. That Heated Strength is an unusual book, but it's got echoes of desire and the numinous, a warm breeze of indescribable richness, and a soft tingling as of foam breaking bubbles over their flesh. So that's an unusual book, so I'll just skip over this fairly quickly so we can move on to, let's just skip this. This is one of the main things that Lewis describes in that Hideous Strength, a third of his Ransom trilogy. He pictures Great Britain, but that there's a supernatural reality behind Great Britain, what is unseen, what is eternal compared to the temporal, whose basic fact is God, and in Great Britain it's nature. In Great Britain, people there have a sense of something beyond this world, but in eternity they of course experience that something else. So, very obscure writing of Lewis's says much the same thing, that created things will lead back to God ultimately. Have I made my point? I've quoted I don't know how many books, 8, 10, 12, plus a few essays. Desire is rampant in the writings of Lewis. And remember, quoted this earlier, he once wrote, in a certain sense, everything else that has ever happened to me was insignificant in comparison. So let's shift to, where did desire come from, if I've defined it correctly? Lewis wrote an introduction to D.E. Harding's book, The Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth. And in that intro he says, at the outset, the universe appears packed with will, intelligence, life, and positive qualities. Every tree is a nymph, every planet a god. The advance of knowledge gradually empties this rich and genial universe, first of its gods, then of its colors, smells, sounds, and tastes, finally of solidity itself, as solidity was originally imagined. I talked to somebody recently about the communistic world in the Soviet Union before the fall of the Soviet Union, and their seeming love of concrete, gray, cement buildings in block shape with no sense of beauty or color or wonder, and which is where a very atheistic and Darwinian view of the universe takes you. And eventually all those things are stripped from the universe by a very sterile vision of that sort. So the origin, I think, goes back to the fall into sin by the first people. Been alienated from God ever since. Remember, alienation is a near synonym of this desire. He made us so that we long to return. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says that God has placed eternity in our hearts. We long to return to the original oneness that Adam and Eve had with God in the garden. Longing increases as mankind strays further away from God and is therefore a way back to Him. And I'd like to think that the farther people stray away from God, the stronger the pull, kind of like a rubber band that's being stretched, and if you let go of it, it snaps back. Like there's a greater awareness that the life I live, if it's a very dry, arid, atheistic worldview, there's a greater awareness that something significant is lacking in my life. So there are lots of things that cause desire: books, love, distant mountains, myths, fairy tales, poetry, nostalgia, various aromas. But he says nature and the books now became equal reminders of joy. They weren't the joy itself. Nature, the mere smells, enough to make a man tipsy. Sense ached, I was sick with desire. That's sickness better than health. Distant gods, the past gods of Asgard, or even some of the kind of iconic places in Oxford, England, like Addison's Walk, which is part of Magdalen College where Lewis taught for 29 years. There is a significantly younger Joel Heck on Addison's Walk. Love that place, would love to go back to it too. So what does longing point to? Lewis says, yet beauty is referring to, there was not in them books, in the books or the music that created this longing. It only came through them, and what came through them was longing. But longing for what? If they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols. Just as I have been wrong in supposing that I really desired the Garden of the Hesperides, so also I have been equally wrong in supposing that I desired joy itself. For they are not the thing itself. This is Lewis at his best. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. I'm not sure that there's a better sentence in all of Lewis's writings than that one. Wow. But desire isn't Lewis's exclusive territory. Solomon wrote about it. I mentioned this earlier. He has said everything. He made everything beautiful in his time. He set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Matthew talks about those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Jesus says, if any man is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Revelation says, take from the water of life without cost. Psalm 63 and many other psalms, you, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you, I thirst for you, my whole being longs for you. I remember reading a psalm like that years ago and wondering, what's wrong with this writer? I didn't get it then, but now I think I do. Your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you, I'll be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods, with singing lips my mouth will praise you. Even Friedrich Nietzsche, the atheist, the Superman, inspiring writer for communism and the Third Reich, his German phrase translated, all desire wants eternity, wants deep, deep eternity. St. Augustine, you have made yourself for us, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Or Blaise Pascal, what is it then that this desire and this inability proclaim to us, but that there was once in man a true happiness of which there now remained to him only the mark and empty trace, which he in vain tries to fill from all surroundings, seeking from things absent, but help he does not obtain in the things present. But these are all inadequate, because the infinite abyss can only be filled by an infinite and immutable object, that is to say, only by God himself. Princeton philosopher, we spend our lives seeking to satisfy our never-ending desires, but we never seek God. In fact, we cannot at first seek God. Initially, we have no idea what it is that we're seeking. God is unlike anything in this world, unlike anything we can imagine. Not only do we lack an idea of him so that we can seek him if we wish, we have at first no desire for him. Our desires are for things we can imagine, and they push us on and on relentlessly from one thing to another, seeking in one place after another to satisfy that hunger or fullness. I just realized I was supposed to hand this out after that second slide. And this is sort of an outline of what I'm talking about. I think there's probably enough, maybe a couple more. I've got enough for everybody to have one if they want one. Charles Williams and Owen Barfield were good friends of Lewis. Williams had a romanticism, sterile and mythological. Barfield got a bunch of Oxford friends thinking most deeply about the imagination and the relationship between imagination, reason, and language. Spoke about the necessity of knowing through the imagination. Goethe, Tilliard, an English professor from Cambridge, Keats and Yeats of poets, English poets, Wolfe, Tom Wolfe, Goethe, Blissful Longing, Tilliard, Primal Joy, Melancholy. Keats wrote Ode on Melancholy. Yeats wrote a play called Land of Heart's Desire. Novels of Thomas Wolfe, Passages in James Joyce or Catherine Mansfield, and many others. T.H. White, Charles Williams, Tolkien, Sinclair Lewis, Dylan Thomas, Auden, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Christopher Fry, Walter de la Mare, Robert Bridges, Don Masefield, Wallace Stevens, and a whole bunch of others. I mean, like I said, this isn't Lewis's idea. Many other writers influenced him to come eventually to realize what it is that he was looking for. So why does God put desire in us? Doug Hyatt says, desire, as Lewis envisions it, is a positive force for attracting man to God, as opposed to the negative force contained in a bad conscience and the need for forgiveness in order to stand before a righteous judge. James Higgins says that Lewis sought to awaken a desire for love and goodness with his writings. The love one finds in Lewis's books, Higgins writes, is not the spongy emotion which self-indulgent man sometimes invents for his own pleasure. It is a hard, painful, overwhelming love for which man has been grasping since the beginning of time. What a coming down it is for the little girl who has met love in its varied and splendid forms in the world of fairy, and who settles for that which she finds between the covers of true romance in later years. Kind of cheap novels, I guess. So, origin of desire, purpose, and goal. Desire serves as a hound of heaven. Anybody ever heard of Francis Thompson's poem, Hound of Heaven? Like, describes God as a hound that's chasing after us until he finds us. God is drawing us to himself with cords of infinite desire, as Lewis says in Paralandra. There have been times when I think we do not desire heaven, but more often I find myself wondering whether in our heart of hearts we have ever desired anything else. Lewis says in his book, The Problem of Pain, which I just finished reading a few days ago. And some of my friends in Austin, Texas did also. His goal, again quoting Lewis, Letters to Malcolm on prayer, we may ignore, but we can nowhere evade the presence of God. The world is crowded with him. He walks everywhere incognito. And the incognito is not always hard to penetrate. The real labor is to remember, to attend, in fact, to become awake, still more to remain awake. And I have one more slide, just a kind of a P.S. Lewis died in 1963, and at his funeral service, he's buried in the churchyard of his home church, Holy Trinity, in Headington Quarry. That's the graveyard area where Lewis is buried. Psalm 84 verse 2 was read at his funeral. My soul hath a desire and longing to enter into the courts of the Lord. Well, it's a couple minutes to 8 o'clock, and we ought to break and get some refreshments, stretch, and maybe a little bit of give and take if you'd like to chat about some of this stuff.
What was the year you said he died?
1963. Yes.
I was thinking the scripture that talks about the pearl of great price, and thinking this is heaven. And when you hear the heaven's my home, or when you hear the, I guess it would be a pilgrim and a stranger, the fellow that was, he lost his whole family.
Yeah.
And you talk about how could he have desire when his 6 or 7 kids and his wife died. What was his name, the great hymn writer? His name escapes me.
Escapes me too.
Gerhardt, Paul Gerhardt.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, when he wrote about being a pilgrim and a stranger, and sometimes I feel like that. Like we're preparing for the life to come, and that is our heart's desire. But I don't know that that's put in me by the Lord. It certainly isn't something in my natural flesh I'd be seeking at all.
Yes.
But that's maybe the joy, the pearl, the heavenly home.
Yeah, I think so. I was just another one or two of the many biblical echoes of this concept. If we were to try to come up with a list of all the passages in the Bible that say something about desire or longing for God for eternity, we'd have to write a book this thick, I think, to cover them all. But it's everywhere, especially if we step back and take a little bit of a deeper look at what we're experiencing in life. Well, let's stop here and we'll get some refreshments, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. Well, I have two announcements before we get into this topic. The first one is some friends, Margaret and Johnny in particular, who are probably online watching tonight, encouraged me to turn this talk, which I first gave online earlier this year, into an article. And so I did. And the article's been accepted for publication by CSL, which is the Bulletin of the New York C.S. Lewis Society, and the oldest running periodical on Lewis in the world today. So if there's anybody that is interested in a narrative just version of what you saw in PowerPoint, I mean, it doesn't have any pictures in it, but it's substantially what I just did, or somebody that wasn't here today and maybe is more of a reader than a visual person can take that article, and you're welcome to it. It should be published in CSL before the end of the year, but it's not yet been published. The other thing is, on the last week of the Quest course, and have a drawing, and if you're interested, so you don't have to sign up for the drawing if you don't want to, but my daughter and I wrote co-authored a children's story called The Lion That Roared. And it's available on a print-on-demand website called lulu.com. But we're going to give away a copy of it. So if you're interested in maybe winning that free copy at the end of the Quest class in 3 more weeks, I'll let you put your name into a hat, and we'll have somebody like Susanna draw a name out of the hat without looking, and then whoever's name is drawn will get this book. The Lion That Roared is sort of in the tradition of Narnia, but it's not a Narnia tale. It's about half the length of one of the Chronicles of Narnia, and the implication throughout is that the lion is, in fact, Aslan. But I never use Aslan's name there. All right, so let's get back into our Quest course this evening, the C.S. Lewis on Christian Witness. He had a lot to say about witness, evangelism. He once wrote in an essay, most of my books are evangelistic. One of the reasons why I got into Lewis. Loved his potential for crossing the bridge from the Christian to the atheist, for engaging unbelievers in conversation, for getting them to think about spiritual matters. He said the salvation of a single soul is more important than the production or preservation of all the epics and tragedies in the world. He says, and woe to you if you do not evangelize. He said, the glory of God, and as our only means of glorifying Him, the salvation of human souls is the real business of life. He said, the church exists for nothing else but to draw men into Christ, to make them little Christs. If they're not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, even the Bible itself are simply a waste of time. Strong words, but I love it. What we practice, not say but rare intervals what we preach, is usually our great contribution to the conversion of others. CL is the abbreviation for collected letters. All of Lewis's letters have been published in 3 1,000+ page volumes of letters. A Christmas Sermon for Pagans, an essay that Lewis wrote back in the 1940s, published in the December 1946 issue of the Strand magazine. Is no longer being published. At the time it was in decline, and not too many years hence was stopped publishing. And it was gradually disappearing, and hence the article disappeared, was not rediscovered until a New Zealander by the name of Christopher Marsh discovered it and contacted me. Wasn't so sure if this was really Lewis or not, and so he and I worked together. We found out that it really was by Lewis. We co-authored an article about it, and the article was published 7 years ago in a periodical called Seven, which is the official publication of the world's finest, most comprehensive study center on the writings of C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, G.K. Chesterton, and 4 other British authors. So if you're really interested in it, I suppose we could somehow figure out a way to get that article to you. I probably have it on my computer, actually, if anybody's truly interested. But, so Lewis is writing an article for the Strand for the non-Christian, the Christmas sermon for pagans. How could he communicate, and how could he encourage Christians to communicate with the unbeliever? So as we read this essay, we see a Lewis who loved words and their meanings, championed the objective standard of right and wrong, the echoes in the Abolition of Man and Mere Christianity. We see the idea of myth, which he develops in several places like Narnia and the essay Myth Became Fact. We see his distinction between the pre-Christian and the post-Christian, which he talked about when he gave his very first lecture at Cambridge University. He taught 29 years at Oxford University and 9 years at Cambridge University. So this gap, Lewis later said, between those who worship different gods is not so wide as that between those who worship different gods and those who do not. So the first century world where Christian missionaries were going all around Asia, Africa, and Europe faced pagans, but those pagans believed in some sort of deity. And the pagans today in 21st century Great Britain don't think there is such a thing as a deity. So this is an example of Lewis' belief that any possible Christian apologetic must render paganism due respect. So, as I said, the ancient pagan believed in the reality of and due reverence towards supernatural beings. He also held to, or not he, but they, the ancient pagans held to, or the ancient pagan he, that's what the he refers to, an objective standard of right and wrong and a belief that the gods would hold him accountable for adhering to it. Pagan knew that he had fallen frequently short of this moral standard, and despite his best efforts to remedy the situation, his conscience was not at ease. He felt guilt, which some moderns don't feel at all today. Lewis argues that the skeptical post-Christian is at odds with these views. The post-Christian holds, for Lewis, the post-Christian holds to a skeptical belief that the earth is a spiritless realm of physical matter with mankind at its highest level of being. What was once revered by pagan men as divine creation full of supernatural beings is now viewed by many post-Christians as a mere resource to be exploited, or what I would call a naturalistic world devoid of any evidence of a creator. So Lewis, in the Christmas sermon for pagan, has sympathy for the true pagan, acknowledging that while every bit as sick or sinful as the post-Christian, the pagan had what Lewis called a deep sadness, an awareness of his own moral failure before the divine. Lewis even half-heartedly suggests to his readers that true paganism might be a necessary stage to becoming Christian. Certainly, we must respect the unbeliever. Talking down to them or thinking of them as addle-brained or something beneath us, that doesn't gain a hearing with anyone. So Lewis rephrases the gospel in this essay in pagan-sounding terms for modern readership who are about to celebrate something reminiscent of a pagan festival, the birth of a god. For Lewis, Christ, whom he refers to as the Mighty One, is a God who could perform a wonder that no pagan god of any age could, the removal of guilt and the reconciliation of humanity to the divine. Makes a similar suggestion in another essay, Modern Man and His Categories of Thought, written about the same time as a Christmas sermon for pagan. He adds, if they were Stoics, Orphics, Mithraeus, or peasants worshipping the earth, our task might be easier. That is why I do not regard contemporary paganism as a wholly bad symptom, because most of them think that there is a spiritual world beyond the physical. Footnote on pagan Christ. Some claim that Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection bears a resemblance to the myths of Balder, Osiris, and other stories, dying and rising gods. So they claim the Christian myth is no more valid than these other myths. Just one myth among many. Lewis was willing to call the story of Christ a myth, but a myth that really happened. So not a myth in the sense of something that's a fairy tale or never happened in history, but it is a myth of a story of a dying and rising God that actually took place in history. He says we must not be nervous about parallels in pagan Christ. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. And in Miracles, his book, he called myth a real though unfocused gleam of divine truth falling on human imagination. And aside here, Lewis is so very quotable, as you've figured out already and probably knew long before this evening. A heathen meant a man, and he says this in the essay, Christmas Sermon for Pagans. Heathen meant a man who lived out on the heath, out in the wilds. It's kind of changed its meaning for us today. A pagan meant someone who lived in the Pagus, a small village. Both words meant a rustic, a yokel, a boorish kind of person. When the heathen asked himself what was wrong with the world, he did not immediately reply the social system, or our allies, or education. It occurred to him that he himself might be one of the things that was wrong with the world. He knew he had sinned. So in this essay, Lewis says there are three kinds of people. Those who are sick and don't know it, post-Christians who know enough about religion to think they know better, they have refuted it. Those who are sick and know it, like pagans. And those who have found the cure. Start in the first class, you must go through the second to reach the third. For in a sense, all that Christianity adds to paganism is the cure. This is Lewis talking, not me. Anybody ever heard of a guy named D.T. Niles? Secretary of the World Council of Churches about 120 or 30 years ago. He said evangelism is one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. That's a really good definition of evangelism, which helps us to realize the attitude we need to have when we talk to a pagan, an unbeliever, because he may be a beggar, but so am I. I just happen to know where the bread is located, the bread of life in particular. So, other places he talks about this. We have to convince our hearers of the unwelcome diagnosis before we can expect them to welcome the news of the remedy. Somebody I know might say we have to proclaim the law before the gospel makes any sense. That's basically what Lewis is saying. Knowledge of broken law precedes all other religious experience. This is from Pilgrim's Regress. And this is me talking more than Lewis. Don't talk about sin, because that will automatically raise their defenses. Talk about broken promises, tension in a relationship, fudging the truth, people not getting along with one another, people being self-centered. We describe it instead of using the technical theological term that has so many connotations about it that it's only useful in Christian circles. Well, how to speak to an atheist. Dr. Thompson, this is, I'm drawing this from a chapel talk I gave 7 years ago when I was visiting professor here. And I'm echoing Proverbs 15, the gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So in January 2017, I had just had a book released by Concordia Publishing House called From Atheism to Christianity, subtitled The Story of C.S. Lewis. So I put this on Twitter. I guess it's known as X today, but I'm still having trouble adjusting to the new term. And this Twitter guy says, "You're going the wrong way." And he's referring to the subtitle, "From Atheism to Christianity," should go the other way. Because that's this guy whose handle is print to fits. I'm not sure what that means. I looked him up a few months ago and found him. This is a picture of him. He's talking on the telephone, obviously, or at least maybe he is. I don't know, but that's what he looks like. So I wrote back and I said, "Funny, thanks for the joke." Not joking, you're doing a disservice. He's hoping to engage me to lock horns and to prove me wrong. Little did he know. So what do you think? How should a Christian respond to the antagonism of an atheist? Well, I had time to think about it, which is a good thing, because when I rush in with the first thing that comes to my mind, I'm usually sticking my foot in my mouth in the tradition of the Apostle Peter. But I had time to think about it, pray about it, and I said, eventually, it was still the same day, but a few hours later, "You'd be surprised how kind and generous Lewis was to atheists. After all, he once was one." I think God led me to that response. And then this guy says, "Oh, he's a fantastic person, poor theological choice though." I'm ready to give them both barrels, but again, I ignore my patron saint, Apostle Peter, not really. So we differ on that score. Can I send you a complimentary copy of my book? He writes back, "No thanks, I'm quite happy with my reading options now, plus it would cost you too much to ship it." That's fine. Just know that I have respect for atheists as a result of writing this book. They ask a lot of the right questions. And they do. Why is there so much suffering in the world? That's not a bad question to ask, because a lot of us ask the same question too, right? And I was presumptuous, thanks for being kind, but as I live in South Korea, it really is expensive to ship here. Yeah, Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath." Yeah, it did. 1 Peter 3:15 says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hopes that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." Always got to remember that. So this Print to Fits guy is very active on Twitter, on X. I haven't checked in a while. I assume he's still out there and still looking for Christians to sort of try to make feel uncomfortable. But earlier in 1 Peter 3, Peter wrote, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct." The witness of a gentle and respectful life is something that cuts through some of the hostility. So, truth of the matter is, no one has ever argued a person into the kingdom of God. It's his job to change minds. The Holy Spirit brings us to faith. Months later, he reacted in January. In November, I said, "I'm still willing to send you a copy of my book. Even if you live in South Korea, how are you?" No response. Oh well. I mean, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, "I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the growth." Maybe I did a little watering there. Who knows? Maybe in eternity I'll meet him in heaven. Who knows? But some things you have to kind of leave in the hands of God, because ultimately they are there in God's hands, whether we want them to be or not, or whether we try to take control and operate as though we were in charge. So no contact with him since then. So gentleness and respect, that means you don't say to an atheist, "Did you know there's a national holiday for you atheists?" Yeah, it's April 1st. It's Fool's Day. Ha, ha, ha. Don't do that. That's, you can almost feel the the door slamming shut or the barriers dropping down from the ceiling and putting a wall between the two of you if you do that. They aren't all hardened unbelievers with animosity towards people of faith, nor do they have 10 surefire arguments against Christianity that will bring the Christian faith to its knees in seconds. So many of them, like our neighbors in Austin, Texas a few years ago, are simply responding to a trendy movement that provides temporary relief from feelings of guilt. And if you love them, care for them, and treat them like friends, and make them wonder why you're being so nice to them when you are a religious person and they're not, they don't get that, because they don't get this deep, eternal love of God. Lewis talks about this unsatisfied desire. We've discussed this a little bit already. I think that's a key for reaching the unbelieving world. They also have this sense of longing for something better. Because when I say they ask a lot of the right questions, they do want a cure for cancer. They do want wars to come to an end. They do want a stable family life. There are lots of things that they long for, and it's worth doing what I call the art of asking questions, asking them about the things that they most want out of life and how they hope to get there, and what maybe I could do to help them get there. And in these spiritual conversations, I have the opportunity to tap into longings that are in everybody's life. Here's a technique from one of Lewis's other books, A Preface to Paradise Lost. John Milton, Paradise Lost. Lewis wrote this book that really revolutionized scholarly understanding of Paradise Lost, because at the time that Lewis wrote this book, critics of John Milton were treating Satan as the real hero of the story, and didn't have a lot of good things to say about God, but they thought Satan was pretty well described by Milton. And so Lewis set that back and corrected the record, and this book is still influential these days. But he says these arts, rhetoric and poetry, are definitely aimed at doing something to an audience, and both do it by using language to control what already exists in our minds. It does this by calling the passions to the aid of reason. So you can have the perfect argument, you can logically argue somebody to a standstill or defeat them in a mental battle of wits, and win the battle but lose the war. And that's not going to accomplish a whole lot. So that's the rational side. How do we bring our passions to bear on our reason? Lewis goes on. The proper use of emotion is lawful and necessary because the intellect of itself loses nothing. The transition from thinking to doing in nearly all men at nearly all moments needs to be assisted by appropriate states of feeling. It always boggles my mind when Lewis, who is so widely read, cites Aristotle, and this ancient Greek philosopher from 500 BC has something relevant to say to us today. That's quite a wake-up call for me to realize that, yeah, well, maybe I'm not going to start reading Aristotle, but at least respect when somebody else cites Aristotle. So our witness needs to have the facts, but also the heart, the compassion, the care, the love for the people we're witnessing to. In Studies in Words, Lewis says, in general, emotional words to be effective must not be solely emotional. What expresses or stimulates emotion directly without the intervention of an image or concept expresses or stimulates it feebly. As words become exclusively emotional, they cease to be words, and therefore, of course, cease to perform any strictly linguistic function. They operate as growls or barks or tears. Just emotion. We sometimes call it flying off the handle, or we're not in control anymore. Exclusively is an important adverb here. They die as words not because there is too much emotion in them, but because there is too little. And finally, nothing at all of anything else. So logic is good. passion, reason, or imagination is good, emotion is good, but they got to work together, like he says in this passage. So in New Christianity, Lewis says he set the human race what they call good dreams. I mean, those queer stories scattered all through the heathen religions about a God who dies and comes to life again, and by his death has someone given new life to men. This isn't just in Christianity, it's in other cultures of the world. There's no temperament and no environment in which God has left without a witness of himself. That is, Jesus is already active in your community, in your circle of friends, in the people that don't know him, but don't know that they don't know him. They don't know what they are lacking. Christians also need to be reminded, Lewis writes, that what became fact was a myth, that it carries with it into the world of fact all the properties of a myth. We must not be ashamed of the mythical radiance resting on our theology. We must not be nervous about parallels in pagan Christs. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. Don Richardson, Eternity in Their Hearts. Anybody ever read that book? Heard of it? This book is also in my top 10 along with Van Auken's A Severe Mercy. Chapter 2, Burma, tribe of 100,000 of headhunters who planted human heads in their fields to ensure a good crop. Good. Occasionally, prophets of the true God, whom the Wa people called Sia, condemned headhunting and spirit appeasement. They knew it was wrong. One prophet called Pu Chan appeared in the 1880s. He persuaded many of the Wa to abandon headhunting and spirit appeasement. Why? Sia was about to send their white brother with a copy of the lost book. How does he know this? If that brother finds us doing evil, he might turn away. Don't want that. This is in Richardson's book, Eternity in Their Hearts. So if you're interested in a good read, boy, I mean, it's probably out of print, but I bet you can get a used copy. One morning, Richardson writes, Pu Chan saddled a Wa pony. Follow this pony, he said to some of his disciples. Sia told me last night that the white brother has finally come near. Sia will cause this pony to lead you to him. When you find the white brother, let him mount this pony. We would be an ungrateful people if we made him walk the last part of his journey toward us. Pony started walking and they followed it. It led them 200 miles into the city of Kentung, which is the purple in that image on the screen. Then Richardson said, then it turned into the gate of a mission compound and headed straight for a well. The pony stopped beside the well. Pu Chan's disciples looked in all directions but could see no trace of either a white brother or a book. They heard sounds in the well and looked into it. Missionary William Marcus Young climbed out of the well and asked, may I help you? This really happened. The Wa people asked, have you brought a book of God? Young nodded. They fell at his feet and told him the message from Pu Chan, adding, this pony is saddled especially for you. Our people are all waiting. Fetch the book, we must be on our way. There are a few twists and turns because he hadn't been sent there to reach the Wa people, but he got there. Within a few years, 10,000 Wa people were baptized because God had sent good dreams and somehow prophetic messages through unorthodox people in ways that probably whose teachings would not have made it through doctrinal review at LCC CTCR. Lewis, in 1931, had a lengthy conversation with Dyson and Tolkien until 3 a.m. and after, this is Addison's Walk, again, you might recognize it from earlier. After Tolkien left, he continued until 4 a.m. with Dyson. He later described that conversation in detail. That night, Lewis came to see myth as a gleam of divine truth falling on human imagination. Very possibly that night, Lewis described myth to Tolkien as lies breathed through silver. Tolkien and Dyson must have shown Lewis that the historical nature of the Gospels must be reckoned with even while allowing myth to remain myth. God's myth had come into history and the New Testament Gospels could no longer be dismissed. Lewis's introduction of a hermit whose name was History as a character in the Pilgrim's Regress confirms the importance of history and the historicity of the Gospels. And Lewis thought that myth in pagan stories was God expressing himself through the minds of the pagan poets, with God using the images of the language of the poets. But he began to see that Christianity was God also expressing himself through real things, particularly the historical events of the death and resurrection of Christ. Now this is Lewis writing in a letter to his good friend Arthur Greaves shortly after that midnight conversation. He says, "Now the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. And one must be content to accept it in the same way, remembering that it is God's myth where the others are men's myths, i.e. the pagan stories are God expressing himself through the minds of poets such as using such images as he found there, while Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things." So the Christ figure of Narnia is the talking lion Aslan. The story of his death and resurrection is told in the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. That's myth. Didn't actually happen. There is no real Aslan. But then again it did. Because not only did Jesus of Nazareth die and rise again, but John wrote in Revelation 5 about Jesus who is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Interesting metaphor. And on Narnia, Lewis wrote, "Any amount of theology can now be smuggled into people's minds under the cover of romance without their knowing it." Lewis says, "I thought I saw how stories of this kind," so story in Christian witness is a powerful tool. I'm going to get into that more next week. "I thought I saw how stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings, and reverence itself did harm. The whole subject was associated with lowered voices, almost as if it were something medical. But supposing that by casting all these things into imaginary worlds, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency, could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could." Isn't that a cool sentence? Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? These pagan individuals who have their defenses up and are not prepared to hear evidence for the resurrection. Read a Lee Strobel book, for instance, which are great books, but is prepared to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and see death and resurrection occur there. And maybe allow God to open them a little bit more to the reality of the imaginative world, which has parallel to the world we live in. It would be much truer to say that the fairyland arouses a longing, remember there's that word again, a longing for he knows not what. It stirs and troubles him with a dim sense of something beyond his reach, and far from dulling or emptying the actual world, gives it a new dimension of depth. Lewis told his biographer and former student and then English professor and then biographer George Sayer on Narnia, "I am aiming at a sort of pre-baptism of the child's imagination." Rational argument, apologetics, not as effective as in the past. Mine are preparatio evangelica. I mean, Lewis throws Latin phrases, Greek phrases, German, French, left and right, as though we all know all these languages, but because he knows them so well. But preparation for the gospel, you can sort of see that in the Latin words. Mine are preparation for the gospel rather than evangelism, an attempt to convince people that there is a moral law, that we disobey it, that's the work of the law, and that the existence of a lawgiver is at least very probable, and also, unless you add the Christian doctrine of the atonement, that this imparts despair rather than comfort. If you wish to believe in Christ, you must become sick, for Christ is a physician only for those who are sick. The came to seek and to save the lost, therefore you must first become a lost and condemned sinner. He is the good shepherd who goes in search of the lost sheep, therefore you must first realize that you are lost sheep. Goodness. Is this Lewis or Luther? I mean, this is, the first syllable sounds the same, right? Lewis, Luther. Those guys had a lot in common. Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, talked about that. Expensive, but probably more effective than 1,000 short tracts that you might hand out. Garrison Keillor. Anybody heard of him? I think people do want to hear the gospel in the form of a story. There's a story at the heart of every sermon. Lots of examples I could give you from the Chronicles of Narnia. I'm still about 30 slides from the end of this. So this place where Eustace Scrubb turns into a dragon, and now he is beginning to have second thoughts about how he had acted. He wanted to be friends. He wanted to get back among humans to talk and laugh and share things. He realized that he was a monster cut off from the whole human race, and appalling loneliness came over him. And so to escape from this dragon nature that he has received, Aslan has to tear the dragon's skin from him by his claws. After Eustace tries to do it himself and fails, reminds us of the inability that we have to convert ourselves, to change our nature, that it has to be done from the outside by the God who is capable of doing that. Another example from The Horse and His Boy, Shasta has to meet his sinful self before he is transformed. He sees Aslan. He doesn't know it's Aslan, it's just a cat, mangy old cat. But that cat had delivered him from jackals late at night in the realm of the tombs. And so he says to the cat, as though the cat could hear, "I'll never do anything nasty to a cat again as long as I live," said Shasta, half to the cat, half to himself. "I did once, you know. I threw stones at a half-starved, mangy old stray." "Hey, stop that!" For the cat had turned around and given him a scratch. "None of that," said Shasta. "It isn't as if you could understand what I'm saying." Well, you know, that was, Aslan had kind of morphed into this cat. Voyage of the Dawn Treader, end of the story. "Dearest," said Aslan very gently to Edmund and Lucy, "you and your brother will never come back to Narnia." "Oh, Aslan," said Edmund and Lucy, both together in despairing voices. "You're too old, children," said Aslan. "Down, you must begin to come close to your own world now." "It isn't Narnia, you know," sobbed Lucy. "It's you. We shan't meet you there, and how can we live never meeting you?" "Well, you shall meet me, dear one," said Aslan. Are you there too, sir?" said Edmund. "I am," said Aslan, "but there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. This was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there." Lyle Dorset, Lewis scholar, said that the first of the Ransom trilogy was written for people who never read the Bible or enter church, designed to draw unsuspecting materialists into a story that would tempt them to contemplate spiritual realities and the struggle between good and evil. And I think it's true of all three of the Ransom trilogy. Lewis says the inhibitions which I hope my stories would overcome in a child's mind may exist in a grown-up's mind too, and may perhaps be overcome by the same means. Well, maybe we'll skip through some of these more quickly, or time is coming to an end. Very cool section of Mere Christianity. Everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny, sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant, but however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kinds of things they say. They say things like this: "How would you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat, I was there first. Leave him alone, he isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange, I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised." People say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups, pagans as well as Christians. Now, what interests me about all these remarks is the man who makes them is not merely saying the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about, and the other man very seldom replies to hell with your standard. He knows what he's talking about. Christianity simply does not make sense, Mere Christianity, Book 1, Chapter 5, until you face the sort of facts I've been describing. It therefore has nothing, as far as I know, to say to people who do not know what they have done anything, that they have done anything to repent of, and do not feel that they need any forgiveness. I used to go to a barber in Grafton, Wisconsin, when we lived there, and claimed to be an atheist. And he asked me once, we got to talking, knew I was a Christian, asked me why I believe in God, and instead of trying to argue with him, I said, because I do things that are wrong, and I feel guilty about it when I do things that are wrong. I think pretty much everybody has that experience, and I've found that in the message of the Bible and what the church has to offer, that there is a way to release that guilt and have it removed so I'm not carrying that any longer. And he really resonated with that. I mean, he didn't become a Christian on the spot, but he understood because I was talking his language. Michael Ward, probably the world's #1 Lewis scholar, says to exhort a non-Christian to come to Jesus on the basis of these platitudes, basic biblical truths like sin and grace, is to add irritation to ignorance, to utter abracadabra over hocus pocus. Somehow the evangelist must excite or reveal or remind his audience of the experiences that will transform hocus pocus back into hoc est corpus, which is Latin for "this is my body," the Lord's Supper stuff. In a letter to the BBC before he gave his broadcast talks that became Mere Christianity, he said, "I think what I want mainly is to talk about the law of nature, or objective right and wrong. It seems to me that the New Testament, by preaching repentance and forgiveness, always assumes an audience who already believe in the law of nature and know they have disobeyed it. In modern England, Canada maybe, we cannot at present assume this, and therefore most apologetic begins a stage too far on. The first step is to create or recover the sense of guilt." So that's what he wants to do in the first book, first series of lectures for Mere Christianity. So he wants to remind people of the reality of the moral law that everybody knows deep down inside because they're born with it. Yeah, we quoted that one earlier. So Lewis, just to give you when I ran into this, I was reading an essay by Michael Ward about Mere Christianity and the metaphors, analogies, and picture language Lewis uses to describe conversion. It kind of shocked me. I hope it does that to you. So Ward read through Mere Christianity looking for the ways in which Lewis describes conversion without using the word conversion. Coming to faith in Christ is like joining a campaign of sabotage, falling at someone's feet, putting yourself in someone's hands, taking on board fuel or food, laying down your rebel arms and surrendering, saying you're sorry, laying yourself open, turning full speed astern, like killing part of yourself, learning to walk or to write, buying God a present with his own money, a drowning man clutching at a rescuer's hand, a tin soldier or statue becoming alive, waking after long sleep, getting close to someone or becoming infected, like dressing up or pretending or playing, like emerging from the womb or hatching from an egg, like a compass needle swinging to the north, a cottage being made into a palace, a field being plowed and resown, a horse turning into a Pegasus, a greenhouse, is this long enough? A greenhouse roof becoming bright in the sunlight, coming around from anesthetic, coming out of the wood, or like going home. All of those analogies that Lewis uses in Mere Christianity for coming to faith, teaching us how to recast our Christian theology of conversion in language that people understood. Like with Charles Dickens, Lewis would have said that every man who seeks heaven must be born again in the good thoughts of his Maker. I sincerely believe that it is expedient for every hound to say so in a certain snuffling form of words, to which he attaches no good meaning, I do not believe. For Lewis's own conversion to surprised by joy, it's like a soldier unbuckling his armor, a snowman beginning to melt, a man being arrested, a fox being hounded, check and checkmate. And that's from Surprised by Joy. That's another list of 5 analogies from Lewis's writings that aren't in Mere Christianity. So I'll skip over. We should talk in concrete language. We should talk in clear language as much as possible. I think this PowerPoint will be up on our website if you want to download it and see the parts that I'm skipping over. In the interest of time, got to learn to speak the language of the people we're speaking to. You don't have to believe that all other religions are simply wrong all through. It does mean that where we differ from other religions, we're right and they're wrong. Lewis, I'll just skip this stuff quickly. From the Weight of Glory, sort of a reprise from the Spring Quest course. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest, most uninteresting person, the pagan even, you talk to one day may be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all. Only in a nightmare all day long we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of these destinations. And I want to help those pagans to that destination, the heavenly destination. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You'll never talk to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors are everlasting splendors, and I feel like I'm doing an injustice to the quotation by rushing over it so fast, because there's so much good stuff in here. This does not mean that we are to be perpetually solemn and must play, but our merriment must be of that kind. This is my last slide, must be of that kind, and it is in fact the merriest kind which exists between people who have from the outset taken each other seriously. No flippancy, no superiority, talking down to people, but deal with them with gentleness and respect. No presumption, and our charity must be a real and costly love, with deep feelings for the sins in spite of which we love the sinner. No mere tolerance or indulgence which parodies love as flippancy parodies merriment. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is holy in almost the same way, for in him Christ also, Latin phrase means, is truly hidden. Very loud to talk. The glorifier and the glorified. Glory himself is truly hidden in that neighbor. So, 2 minutes to 9 or thereabouts. Time for questions, comments, discussion. Yes, Barry.
The question I have, if C.S. Lewis were alive today, and I thought seriously about this, how would he deal with those, including my own kids, who have left the church? And I suggest many of those who have left, it's been through disappointment or through some sort of indignity they felt they suffered. And how do we reach that particular person?
How would we reach the people who are part of our families, part of the Christian faith at one point and have fallen away? If Lewis were alive today, what would he tell us? I mean, I gave you some answers to that question. Love them until they ask you why. Communicate with them in story. Don't cut off conversation with them. Stay in touch. Remember their birthdays, their anniversaries. Invite them to consider certain powerful stories that you run into, examples of people who have lived their faith in a real genuine way, even personal stories from your own life. If there's ever any fault that we have, that we carry because of, that helped lead them to fall away, to apologize for that, to be vulnerable. I mean, I don't think there's one size fits all or an easy answer to the question, because every person's story is unique and we need to recognize it as such. But to be willing to listen. I mean, I used to make calls on people in the community, and I run into a lot of people that used to be part of the church, and I would ask them always, what led you to drop out? And then I also asked them, what would be a motivation to lead you to think about dropping back again? Because most of them have just sort of left the church, shut the door, and they're not thinking about that anymore. But I phrased the question, and who knows what impact that had in some people's lives, but to help them think about the fact that they haven't turned their backs on the church forever, hopefully haven't. God certainly hasn't turned his back on them. So patience, I guess I could say love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, all those fruits of the Spirit are part of the answer. And but it's not like it's a slot machine. If we just come up with the right words, the right combination, the right story, the right this or that, then they'll be back. Because finally the responsibility for their spiritual status rests with them. And just like the rich young ruler walked away sad, and Jesus didn't go running after him and grab him by the lapels and shake him and say, no, you can't do that, your entire eternal life is at stake here. He let him walk away. So sometimes I think family members need to have the space to walk away and to run into the implications or the results of walking away, but always to know that I'm there, I still love you, you're my child, you're my friend, and I'm ready to help you, if I can at all, take your hand and walk you back into the presence of God.
That's a prayer. That's a prayer.
Yeah, that's... Anybody else? It's past 9 o'clock, so I finished before 9, but we're 1 minute after. Boy, we can stay and talk if you want to, but I do want to respect your time and thank you for coming, and hopefully we'll see you all in a week. But yeah, let's close with a prayer. Lord, we do pray for those people who are outside the Christian faith, some that used to be on the inside, or at least we think they were. We also are reminded that you are the one who cares for them, who loves them, who is the one that brings them back to faith. And so we ask you to do that for those people that are on our hearts that we perhaps name before you. Give us also words to say in the circumstances that can have an impact on people's lives and help them to realize that there is a God who loves them, that there is a world outside of this material world full of wonder and beauty and an eternal presence that is awaiting for them if they but want it. So we ask you to guide us with that and be with our loved ones, our friends, those that have turned away from the church, that they might turn back one day by your power and at your initiative. O Hound of Heaven, O Chess Master, O Angler, who is constantly seeking and saving the lost. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.